Some losses change a man so deeply that even his dog stops wagging its tail. Donald Proder knows this kind of grief, the kind that follows you into empty rooms and makes silence feel like company. After his wife Martha passed, Donald took her, faithful dog Eli, to a forgotten cabin in the Pennsylvania woods. Both man and animal carried the same heavy sadness, finding comfort only in each other's quiet presence. For weeks, they shared simple meals and long silences, two broken hearts healing at their own pace. Then one morning, something changed. Eli suddenly ran into the forest and returned with 5 barefoot, frightened children trailing behind him. These weren't just any children, they were runaways from a tragedy that left them with nowhere to go. Donald faced a choice that would test everything he believed, turn them away and honor his Amish ways, or open his heart to the family he never thought he'd have. What happens when doing right means breaking every rule you've lived by? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like old memories, as Donald Proder stood on the cabin's weathered porch, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The liquid had grown cold while he watched the children sleep through. The single window, their small forms huddled together on the braided rug near the stone fireplace. Martha's hand-carved wooden cross hung on the wall above them, catching the first rays of sunlight that filtered through the trees. 43 years. That's how long he and Martha had shared the same bed, the same prayers, the same quiet contentment in their simple Amish life. Donald's weathered fingers traced the rim of his coffee cup, the same blue-speckled enamel one Martha had used every morning, filling it first for him before pouring her own. She always said the husband should drink first, though Donald had spent decades trying to convince her otherwise. Their home back in Lancaster County had been filled with the sounds of Martha's humming, the gentle clatter of her quilting frame, the soft whisper of her prayers at dawn. But it had never held the laughter of children. The Lord had seen fit to bless them with each other, Martha would say whenever the subject arose, her hand finding his across the dinner table. They had tried for children in those early years, hoped and prayed through each passing month, but eventually accepted that some gifts were not meant for them. Donald had convinced himself he was content with that acceptance. He'd watched his brother's children grow, held his nieces and nephews at church gatherings, and told himself that being Uncle Donald was enough. Martha had poured her maternal instincts into the community's children, always the first to volunteer for school events, always ready with a kind word and a fresh-baked cookie for any child who needed comfort. When the cancer came, it took her slowly, like winter creeping across a field. Donald had sat beside her bed for weeks, reading scripture aloud, holding her hand as her breathing grew shallow. Even in those final days, she worried about him more than herself. "Promise me you'll find your way to joy again," she'd whispered. On that last morning, her eyes still bright with the love that had sustained them both. "The Lord has more plans for you, Donald. I can feel it," he'd promised, though the words felt hollow in his throat. How could there be joy without her laugh echoing through their kitchen? How could there be purpose without her gentle guidance, steering their days? The weeks following Martha's burial had been a blur of casseroles and condolences. The community meant well. His Amish neighbors understood grief, understood loss, understood the importance of gathering around those who mourned. But their kindness felt suffocating. Every concerned glance, every offer to help with daily tasks, every gentle suggestion that perhaps it was time to consider living with one of his brothers, felt like pressure against a wound that wouldn't heal. Eli had been Martha's constant companion in those final months, a border collie mix with intelligent brown eyes and a coat the color of autumn leaves. The dog had taken to following Donald everywhere after Martha's passing, but the joy had gone out of him. No more tail wagging when Donald returned from the barn, no more playful barking at squirrels. Eli moved through each day with the same heavy sorrow that weighed on Donald's shoulders. It was Bishop Miller who'd mentioned the cabin, Martha's uncle, Joseph had been what the community called English, someone who'd left the Amish way decades ago to live among the outside world. When he died childless, his modest estate had somehow found its way to Martha. Perhaps some time away would do you good, the bishop had suggested during one of his pastoral visits. The solitude might bring you peace. Donald had resisted at first. Leaving felt like abandoning Martha's memory, like walking away from everything they'd built together. But as the days stretched into weeks and the well-meaning visits continued, he found himself yearning for a place where his grief could exist, without explanation, where he could mourn without having to manage other people's discomfort with his sorrow. The cabin sat 30 miles deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that wound through stands of old-growth pine and maple. It was smaller than Donald had expected. 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a porch that sagged slightly on the eastern end. Uncle Joseph had clearly been more interested in solitude than comfort. The furniture was sparse, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed frame, and shelves lined with books Donald couldn't read. Volumes of poetry and philosophy written in English rather than the German he knew from Scripture. But there was something about the place that spoke to the hollow spaces in Donald's chest. The morning silence was complete, except for birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine needles. The evening sky stretched wider here, painted in colors that seemed to change every night. For the first time since Martha's death, Donald found he could breathe without feeling like his lungs were wrapped in barbed wire. He'd established simple routines: morning prayers at dawn, coffee on the porch, reading from the German Bible Martha had given him on their first anniversary. He'd brought tools with him, his woodworking equipment, materials for simple repairs, but found himself mostly sitting, mostly remembering, mostly letting the grief flow through him like water through a creek bed. Eli had seemed to approve of the arrangement. The dog spent his days exploring the surrounding forest, though he never strayed far from the cabin. In the evenings, he'd curl up beside Donald's chair, both of them staring into the fire, both of them missing the same gentle voice that used to fill their silences. 3 weeks had passed in this quiet rhythm before the morning everything changed. Donald had been sitting on the porch, watching the sunrise paint the treetops gold, when Eli suddenly lifted his head. The dog's ears pricked forward, and for the first time since Martha's death, his tail gave a tentative wag. Then he was off, bounding into the forest with more energy than Donald had seen in months. Donald called after him, but Eli was already disappearing between the trees. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Donald found himself pacing the small cabin, worry gnawing at his stomach. Eli had never run off like that, never left Donald alone for more than a few minutes. The forest was full of dangers. Bears, wildcats, steep ravines that could trap or injure an aging dog. When Eli finally emerged from the tree line, Donald's relief turned to shock. The dog wasn't alone. Behind him, moving slowly and nervously, came 5 children. They were a pitiful sight. Barefoot, their clothes torn and dirty, their faces marked by exhaustion and fear. The oldest appeared to be a girl of perhaps 12, her brown hair tangled with twigs and leaves. She held the hand of a little boy who couldn't have been more than 6, while 2 children who looked like twins flanked them on either side. In the girl's other arm, she cradled what Donald realized was a baby, probably no more than 3 years old. The children stopped at the edge of the clearing, their eyes wide with uncertainty. The little boy pressed closer to the older girl, while the twins, a boy and girl who might have been 9, stood ready to bolt back into the forest. Only the baby seemed unafraid, her bright eyes taking in everything with curious interest. Donald rose slowly from his chair, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Children didn't just appear in the wilderness. They didn't survive in the forest without help, without adults, without supplies. Yet here they were, clearly, having been on their own for some time, clearly in need of help. "It's all right," he said softly, the way he'd speak to a skittish horse. "You're safe here. The older girl took a half-step forward, her chin raised with a courage that impressed Donald despite her obvious fear. "We won't cause trouble, mister," she said, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "We just need some water, maybe a little food, then we'll be on our way." Donald looked into her eyes and saw something that made his chest tighten. This child had been carrying responsibility far too heavy for her young shoulders. She was protecting the others, trying to make decisions that no 12-year-old should have to make. "What are your names?" Donald asked gently. The girl hesitated, then seemed to decide that honesty was their best option. "I'm Mary. This is Ben." She gestured to the little boy at her side. "The twins are Sam and Sarah, and this is Grace." She adjusted the baby in her arms, and Donald noticed how naturally she supported the child's weight, how comfortable she seemed with the responsibility. "Where are your parents, Mary?" At this question, the girl's composure wavered. "We don't have any, sir." "Not anymore." Donald felt something shift in his chest, a stirring of emotion he hadn't experienced since Martha's death. These children were alone in the world, carrying burdens that would challenge grown men. They were hungry, frightened, and desperately in need of help. Everything in his Amish upbringing told him to be cautious. The community maintained careful boundaries with the outside world for good reason. Getting involved with English children, especially children without families, could lead to complications with authorities, with social services, with a system that operated by rules Donald didn't understand. But looking at their faces, at Mary's brave determination, at little Ben's wide eyes, at the way the twins held hands as if that connection was all they had left in the world, Donald felt Martha's words echo in his memory. "The Lord has more plans for you." "Come inside," he said, stepping back to open the cabin door wider. "Let's get you fed and cleaned up. Then we'll figure out what comes next." Mary's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it. "Thank you, sir. We won't stay long, I promise." As Donald watched the 5 children file into his small cabin, with Eli wagging his tail for the first time in months, he realized that his quiet retreat from the world had just become something entirely different. The wooden cross on the wall seemed to catch the light differently now, as if reflecting a prayer he hadn't yet had the courage to speak aloud. The children sat around Donald's rough-hewn table like refugees from a war zone, which Donald was beginning to understand might not be far from the truth. He'd set out what food he had: thick slices of bread, butter, some preserved meat, and a jar of Martha's blackberry jam he'd brought from home. The children ate with careful restraint, trying to maintain manners even as their hunger was obvious. It was while Mary was coaxing little Grace to take sips of milk that Donald noticed her hand tremble as she reached for her own piece of bread. Hidden in her dress pocket, he glimpsed a corner of something, a torn piece of paper that looked official, with printing on it. "Mary," Donald said gently, "that paper in your pocket. Is it important?" The girl's eyes went wide with panic. She glanced at the twins, at Ben, as if looking for permission to speak. Finally, her shoulders sagged with the weight of secrets too heavy for someone her age. "It's from the train," she whispered. The orphan train. Donald had heard whispers of such things in his community, trains that carried parentless children from overcrowded cities to rural areas where they might find families willing to take them in. But he'd always imagined it as an act of Christian charity, a way to give children better lives. "Can you tell me about it?" he asked, his voice as gentle as when he'd spoken to Martha during her illness. Mary's story came out in fragments, interrupted by Ben's quiet sniffles and the twins' occasional corrections. They had been living in an orphanage in Philadelphia, not because they were orphans, Mary explained with fierce pride, but because their families had been told it was temporary, just until they could get back on their feet. "Mama said she'd come for us," Sarah whispered, speaking for the first time since arriving. "She said it would just be for a few months, until Papa found work again, but months had turned into a year, and then social workers had come with papers saying the children were being relocated to better opportunities in the rural areas. They were loaded onto a train with dozens of other children, bound for various towns across Pennsylvania where families had requested workers, farm hands, household help, children to raise as their own. They told us we were going to new families, Sam said, his young voice bitter with betrayal. They said people were waiting for us, excited to have us. The train had been traveling through mountainous terrain when something went wrong. Mary wasn't sure exactly what. Maybe a rock slide, maybe mechanical failure. All she remembered was the terrible sound of metal grinding against metal, the sensation of the world turning sideways, and then darkness. When she woke up, she was in a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal. The car they'd been riding in had separated from the engine and rolled down an embankment. Of the 23 children who'd been in their car, only 5 had survived. Mary pulled the torn paper from her pocket with shaking hands. It was indeed a train ticket, but as Donald examined it more closely, he saw it was more than that. There were names, ages, and destinations, but there was also something that made his blood run cold, a stamp that read property transfer, and signatures that looked more like business transactions than adoption papers. How long ago did this happen? Donald asked. 5 days, Mary said. Maybe 6. We've been walking ever since. Donald studied the children's faces, seeing now what he'd missed before. These weren't just hungry, tired children. They were traumatized survivors of something horrific. Little Ben had a bruise on his forehead that was just beginning to fade. Sarah favored her left leg when she walked. Sam had scratches on his arms that looked like they'd come from crawling through wreckage. Mary, Donald said carefully, do you know where your real families are? Your parents? The girl's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for days. They took us so far from Philadelphia. And the lady at the orphanage said, her voice broke. She said if we ever tried to run back, they'd make sure we never saw our families again. She said our parents had signed papers giving us up for good. Donald felt anger rise in his chest, a righteous fury he hadn't experienced since watching Martha suffer through her illness. These children hadn't been orphans in need of homes. They'd been taken from families who were struggling, separated from parents who were likely still searching for them. Sir? Ben's small voice interrupted Donald's thoughts. Are you going to send us back? The question hit Donald like a physical blow. Send them back where? To authorities who might return them to a system that had treated them like cargo. To people who might not believe their story about the train wreck. To a bureaucracy that had already failed them once. Donald looked around his small cabin at these 5 broken children who had somehow found their way to his door. Martha's wooden cross seemed to catch the afternoon light differently now, and he could almost hear her voice. The Lord has more plans for you, but those plans would require breaking every rule he'd lived by for 63 years. The Amish way was to stay separate from English troubles, to avoid entanglement with government systems, to trust in providence while maintaining careful boundaries with the outside world. Taking in these children, especially children who were likely being searched for by authorities, would violate everything his community stood for. Yet as he watched Mary gently wipe Grace's face, as he saw Sam and Sarah instinctively reach for each other's hands, as he noticed Ben's eyes following his every movement with desperate hope, Donald felt something Martha had planted in his heart years ago beginning to bloom. No, he said finally. I'm not going to send you back. The relief that washed over the children's faces was overwhelming. Mary actually began to cry, the first time she'd allowed herself that vulnerability since arriving. Ben scrambled around the table to hug Donald's leg, while the twins smiled for the first time since emerging from the forest. But we need to be smart about this, Donald continued. There will be people looking for you. Important people with badges and authority. We need to figure out how to keep you safe while we sort this out. As if summoned by his words, Eli suddenly lifted his head from where he'd been dozing by the fireplace. The dog's ears pricked forward, and he moved to the window. A low growl rumbling in his throat, in the distance barely audible, came the sound Donald had been dreading. The mechanical whine of engines, the crackle of radio communications, the organized noise of a search party moving through the forest. Everyone stay calm, Donald said, though his own heart was racing. Mary, take the children to the back room. Keep Grace quiet if you can. Don't come out until I tell you." As the children hurried to hide, Donald noticed something that gave him hope. For the first time since Martha's death, Eli's tail was wagging, not with the excitement of discovery, but with the protective instinct of a dog who'd found something worth defending. Donald smoothed his beard, straightened his simple black vest, and stepped out onto the porch to wait for whatever was coming. In his pocket, he could feel the torn train ticket Mary had shown him, and in his heart, he could feel Martha's presence as surely as if she were standing beside him. The children were his now, whether the law understood it or not, and Donald Proder had never in his life backed down from doing what he believed was right. The search party passed by without stopping, their voices fading into the deeper woods as they followed what must have been another trail. Donald waited on the porch until the sounds of their engines disappeared completely before calling the children back to the main room. When they emerged from hiding, their faces showed a mixture of relief and lingering fear that broke his heart. "They're gone for now," Donald said, "but they'll be back. We need to make some changes around here." Over the next few hours, Donald transformed his simple retreat into something resembling a home for 6. He moved his own belongings to a corner of the main room, creating sleeping space for the children near the fireplace, where they'd be warmest. Martha's apron, which he'd brought along without really knowing why, became a makeshift curtain to give Mary some privacy when she needed to tend to baby Grace. The children watched his preparations with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief, as if they couldn't quite accept that someone was actually caring for them. Mary tried to help with everything, her 12-year-old shoulders still carrying the weight of responsibility she'd assumed during their ordeal. "Mary," Donald said gently as she attempted to organize the sleeping arrangements, "you don't have to take care of everyone anymore. That's my job now." The girl looked up at him with eyes far too old for her face. "I promised I'd keep them together," she said. When everything happened, I promised we wouldn't get separated." Donald knelt down to her level, his weathered hands gentle as he placed them on her small shoulders. "And you did that. You kept your promise. You got them all to safety. But now you can be 12 years old again, instead of trying to be their mother." For a moment, Mary's careful composure cracked, and Donald saw the frightened child beneath the brave exterior. Then she straightened her shoulders again, but this time it seemed less like carrying a burden and more like accepting help. As evening approached, Donald began establishing routines that felt natural to him. He led the children in simple prayers, not the complex German liturgy of his church, but basic words of gratitude that even little Ben could understand. "Thank you for this food, for this shelter, for bringing us together," he said, and was surprised to hear his own voice growing stronger with each word. The children joined hands around the table, and Donald felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, the warm satisfaction of a family gathering for a meal. Grace babbled happily from Mary's lap, reaching for the light that danced from the kerosene lamp. Ben asked for seconds on everything, his 6-year-old appetite finally getting the attention it deserved. The twins, Sam and Sarah, began to show distinct personalities now that their survival wasn't at stake every moment. Sam was curious about everything: how the cabin was built, why Donald's clothes were different from what they'd seen in the city, what all the tools in the corner were for. Sarah was gentler, more observant, noticing when someone needed help before they asked for it. She was the first to see that Grace was getting fussy and needed to be walked around the room. "Are you really going to let us stay?" Ben asked as Donald tucked a blanket around his small form. "For as long as you need," Donald replied, and realized he meant it completely. That night, Donald lay awake, listening to the children's breathing gradually settle into the rhythm of sleep. It had been months since he'd shared living space with anyone, and the sounds of other people, soft sighs, the rustle of blankets, Grace's occasional sleepy murmur, filled spaces in his heart he'd thought were permanently empty. When morning came, Donald woke to find Mary already up, trying to quiet Grace so the baby wouldn't wake the others. He rose quietly and joined her by the fireplace, where she was gently rocking the toddler. "She's used to waking up early," Mary whispered. "At the orphanage, they had us all up before dawn for chores." Donald took Grace from Mary's arms, surprised by how natural it felt to hold a child. The baby looked up at him with bright, trusting eyes and reached for his beard with chubby fingers. "What kind of chores?" Donald asked, keeping his voice low. "Laundry, cooking, cleaning. The older kids took care of the younger ones while the adults did. Other things." Mary's voice carried a bitterness that seemed wrong coming from someone so young. As the other children gradually woke up, Donald began to understand the dynamics that had developed between them. Mary was clearly the leader and protector, but Ben looked to Sam for play and adventure, while Sarah seemed to be everyone's comforter, the one who noticed when someone was sad or afraid. After a simple breakfast, Donald made a decision that surprised even himself. "Today I'm going to teach you some things," he announced. "What kind of things?" Sam asked, his curiosity immediately piqued. "How to live here, how to be safe in the woods, how to take care of each other in this place." Donald gestured around the cabin. "If you're going to stay, you need to know how things work." What followed was the most purposeful Donald had felt since Martha's death. He showed Sam and Ben how to split kindling safely, taught Sarah and Mary how to manage the cabin's simple wood stove, and demonstrated how to identify edible plants in the surrounding forest. The children absorbed every lesson with an eagerness that spoke to their desire for stability, for skills that would help them survive whatever came next. Grace proved to be a delightful addition to their activities, toddling around the cabin and babbling commentary on everything that happened. When she took her first wobbly steps from Mary to Donald, reaching for him with complete trust, Donald felt something inside his chest that had been frozen since Martha's death begin to thaw. "Papa," Grace said clearly, wrapping her small arms around Donald's neck. The word hit Donald with unexpected force. He'd never been called Papa before, had never expected to hear it from any child's lips. Martha had been the one who would have naturally fit into the role of caretaker, the one whose lap children had always sought out at church gatherings. But looking around the cabin at these 5 children who had somehow found their way to his door, Donald began to understand what Martha had meant in those final days. The Lord did have more plans for him, plans that involved becoming something he'd never imagined he could be. That evening, as they sat around the table for their second family meal, Donald pulled out a piece of wood and his whittling knife. "Would you like me to make you something?" he asked Ben, who had been watching the knife with fascination. "Could you make a horse?" Ben asked shyly. "I think I can manage that," Donald replied, and began to carve. As wood shavings curled away from the emerging shape, Donald realized that for the first time since Martha's death, he was creating something new instead of just maintaining what already existed. The children gathered around to watch, and even Eli came closer, his tail wagging gently as he settled down beside Donald's chair, the sound of their quiet conversation, punctuated by Grace's giggles and the soft scrape of knife against wood, filled the cabin with something Donald had thought he'd lost forever, the warm contentment of a family evening at home. 3 days into their new routine, Donald discovered that Mary could read better than he could manage in English, while he was comfortable with German script and could puzzle through basic English words. Mary moved through the books on Uncle Joseph's shelves with an ease that impressed him. "The orphanage had a good library," she explained when he commented on her skill. "Reading was about the only thing they encouraged us to do in our free time." Donald handed her one of Uncle Joseph's simpler volumes, a collection of nature essays that seemed appropriate for someone her age. "Would you mind reading to the others sometimes? I'd think they'd enjoy hearing stories." Mary's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "I'd like that very much." That evening, after their simple dinner of vegetable soup and fresh bread, Mary gathered the younger children around the fireplace and began to read. Her voice was clear and expressive as she brought the words to life, describing forest creatures and mountain streams with an enthusiasm that captured even Grace's attention. The baby sat quietly in Donald's lap, her small fingers playing with the buttons on his vest, while her eyes stayed fixed on Mary's animated face. Donald found himself watching the children more than listening to the story, struck by how naturally they arranged themselves into a family circle. Ben leaned against Sam's shoulder, while Sarah sat cross-legged with perfect posture, absorbing every word. This was what a family evening should look like. Donald realized children gathered together, sharing stories and quiet conversation while the firelight painted warm shadows on the walls. The next morning brought Donald his first real test as a surrogate father. He woke to find Ben burning with fever, his small body shivering despite the warmth of the cabin. Mary was already awake, hovering anxiously over her young charge. "He felt hot when I woke up," she whispered. "I don't know what to do." Donald's experience with childhood illness was limited, but Martha had been the one neighbors called when their children fell sick. He remembered her gentle remedies, her calm presence in the face of worried parents. "Sarah," he called softly, "do you remember seeing any willow trees by the stream yesterday?" The girl nodded, her eyes wide with concern for Ben. "The bark from young willow branches can help bring down a fever. Can you and Sam collect some for me?" While the twins hurried to complete their mission, Donald prepared cool cloths for Ben's forehead and encouraged the boy to sip small amounts of water. Mary hovered nearby, her 12-year-old mind clearly running through worst-case scenarios. "He's going to be all right," Donald assured her. "Children get fevers. It's frightening, but most of the time they recover quickly. What if he doesn't?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper. What if we lose him too?" Donald knelt beside her, understanding suddenly that this child had already experienced too much loss for someone her age. The train wreck, the separation from their families, the deaths of other children in their car. Mary had been carrying the weight of survivors' guilt along with everything else. "We're not going to lose him," Donald said firmly. "And Mary, what happened on that train wasn't your fault. You saved these children. You got them to safety. You've done everything right." When the twins returned with the willow bark, Donald showed them how to prepare a simple tea that would help reduce Ben's fever. The process gave everyone something useful to do, and by afternoon, Ben was sitting up and asking for food. "Uncle Donald," he said, using the title naturally, "will you finish carving my horse?" The word uncle warmed Donald's heart almost as much as Grace's papa had. These children were creating their own family structure, finding ways to belong to each other and to him. That evening, Donald made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He pulled out a piece of paper and began making a list. Supplies they would need if the children were going to stay for more than just a few days. Warmer clothes for the approaching autumn weather. More food than his simple bachelor stores could provide. Perhaps some books that would be appropriate for their ages. The implications of the list were enormous. Buying children's clothes and supplies would require trips to town, interactions with storekeepers, questions he might not be able to answer satisfactorily. But looking around the cabin at 5 children who had begun to call him family, Donald realized he was already past the point of turning back. "Mary," he said as she tucked Grace into her makeshift bed, "tomorrow I need to go into town for supplies. I want you to be in charge while I'm gone." The girl straightened her shoulders with the familiar weight of responsibility. But this time it felt different. Not like a burden she had to carry alone, but like trust being placed in capable hands. "What should I do if someone comes looking for us?" she asked. "Take everyone to the root cellar behind the cabin. There's a good hiding place there, and you can hear anyone coming long before they see you." Donald had spent the morning preparing that very space, clearing it out and stocking it with water and basic supplies. "How long will you be gone?" "Just the day. I'll be back before dark." Donald looked around at all 5 children, his heart swelling with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel again. "Mary, I want you to know, all of you to know, that having you here has given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Ben asked, looking up from the wooden horse that was nearly complete. "Purpose," Donald said simply. "The feeling that what I do each day matters to someone." As he settled down for sleep that night, Donald could hear the children's whispered conversations from their corner of the room. They were planning small improvements to the cabin, discussing what they might plant in a garden come spring, making tentative plans for a future that included him. For the first time since Martha's death, Donald fell asleep not to the sound of his own loneliness, but to the soft murmur of family life continuing around him. Outside, autumn was beginning to touch the edges of the forest, but inside the cabin, something warmer than any season was taking root. Donald's trip to town began before dawn, leaving the children with careful instructions and a heavy heart. The 40-minute drive through winding mountain roads gave him too much time to think about the risks he was taking. Every item on his shopping list, children's clothing, extra food, medical supplies, would raise questions from storekeepers who knew him as a solitary widower. The town of Pine Valley had grown around a lumber mill that had closed decades ago, leaving behind a main street lined with businesses that served the scattered rural population. Donald had visited only once before, when he'd first arrived at the cabin to purchase basic supplies. Now, walking into Henderson's general store with his carefully planned list, he felt like a man walking into a trap of his own making. "Mr. Proder, isn't it?" called out Ellen Henderson from behind the counter. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a tendency toward conversation that Donald had noted during his previous visit. "Haven't seen you in weeks. How are you settling in at the old Hartley place?" "Well enough," Donald replied, keeping his voice even as he pulled out his list. "I need to stock up on some supplies." Ellen's eyebrows rose as she read over his shoulder. "My goodness, planning to feed an army? And children's clothes?" She looked up at him with undisguised curiosity. "Don't tell me you've got grandchildren visiting way out there." Donald felt heat rise in his cheeks, but forced himself to maintain calm. "Family matters," he said simply, which was true enough without being specific. "Well, I'll be," Ellen murmured, but she began gathering the items efficiently. "Little ones, by the sizes you've listed here. Hope they're enjoying the mountain air." While Ellen assembled his order, Donald became aware of voices from the front porch of the store. Through the window he could see two men in uniform, a state trooper and someone who looked like a federal marshal based on his badge. They were showing something to a group of local men, papers that looked official. "Escaped from a train wreck about a week ago," the trooper was saying. 5 children ages 3 to 12. Extremely dangerous for them to be wandering around the mountains alone. Donald's blood went cold as he recognized the description. He forced himself to continue examining Ellen's inventory while straining to hear more of the conversation. "We have reason to believe they might have found shelter somewhere in this area," the marshal added. "Anyone hiding these children, even with good intentions, would be interfering with a federal investigation. The children need to be returned to proper authorities immediately." "Proper authorities," one of the local men said skeptically. "A hotel that train was carrying kids to work farms, not families." "That's not your concern," the marshal replied sharply. "These children are wards of the state. Anyone providing them shelter without reporting it is breaking the law." Ellen had stopped gathering supplies and was listening to the conversation with obvious interest. Donald saw her glance at his list again, her expression growing thoughtful. "Mr. Proder," she said quietly, "those federal folks have been asking questions all over the county. You wouldn't happen to know anything about some missing children, would you?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Donald met Ellen's eyes and saw something there he hadn't expected. Not suspicion, but concern. "Children belong with people who care about them," Donald said carefully. "That's what I believe." Ellen studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Cash or credit for these supplies?" "Cash," Donald replied, grateful for her decision not to press further. As Ellen rang up his purchases, she leaned closer and spoke in a low voice. "Those men asked specifically about anyone buying children's supplies. Said they'd be checking store records." She met his eyes meaningfully. "Of course, I haven't kept very good records lately. Memory's not what it used to be." Donald felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected ally. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Those children you're not hiding," Ellen said with the hint of a smile. "They'd be lucky to have someone looking after them properly." The drive back to the cabin felt longer than usual, Donald's mind racing with the implications of what he'd heard. The federal marshal's presence meant this wasn't just a local missing persons case. It was being treated as something much more serious, and the man's emphasis on proper authorities and federal investigation suggested that the children's story about the orphan train system might be more complicated than even they understood. When Donald finally reached the cabin, he found Mary waiting on the porch, her face pale with worry. "Uncle Donald," she said, running to him as he climbed out of the truck. Men came looking, official men with badges and papers. Donald's heart sank. "Did they see any of you?" "No, we hid in the root cellar, like you said. But they searched the cabin. They looked through everything." Mary's voice shook slightly. "They left papers, official ones. They say anyone helping us is breaking the law." Donald picked up the papers from where they'd been left on his table. The documents were indeed official, bearing federal seals and language about harboring fugitives and interfering with government operations. The penalties mentioned were severe: fines, imprisonment, charges that could destroy a man's life. But as Donald read through the legal threats, he became aware of small sounds from around the cabin. Ben was playing quietly with his carved horse, making soft galloping noises. The twins were helping Grace stack wooden blocks into towers. Mary was organizing the new supplies he'd brought, already planning how to distribute the warmer clothes he'd purchased. These children had been through horrors he could barely imagine. They'd survived a train wreck, lived through days in the wilderness, and found their way to his door by what could only be called Providence. They'd begun to heal here, begun to hope again, begun to trust that someone would protect them. Donald looked down at Sheriff Morrison's badge, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through his window, then folded the federal papers and placed them in the drawer with Martha's letters. "Mary," he said quietly, "gather everyone together. We need to talk about what comes next." As the children assembled around his table, their faces showing a mixture of hope and fear, Donald realized that he'd already made his choice days ago when he'd first invited them inside. The law might be against him, the government might be searching for them, and his own community might reject his decision. But looking at these 5 faces that had become as dear to him as Martha's memory, Donald knew that some laws were higher than others, and some families were formed not by blood or legal documents, but by love and the courage to do what was right. That evening, Donald sat by the firelight with Martha's family Bible open on his lap, seeking guidance in the familiar German phrases that had sustained him through every crisis of his adult life. The children were arranged around him in their usual circle, but tonight the atmosphere felt different, heavier with unspoken questions and fears. "Uncle Donald," Ben asked in his small voice, "are the bad men going to take us away?" Donald closed the Bible and looked at each child in turn. Mary's eyes held the weight of someone far older than 12. The twins sat close together, their usual energy subdued by worry. Grace babbled softly from Mary's lap, the only one seemingly unaffected by the tension that filled the cabin. "I want you all to understand something," Donald said, his voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd used when teaching them practical skills. "What those men are doing, separating children from families, treating young ones like property to be moved around, that's not what God intended. Sometimes doing what's right means standing against what's legal." "But they said you'd go to jail," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with concern. Donald reached over and touched her small hand. "Sarah, when I was your age, my grandfather told me something I've never forgotten. He said that a man's character isn't measured by how well he follows rules, but by how willing he is to do right when it's difficult." "What does that mean?" Sam asked. "It means that protecting you children, keeping you together, making sure you're safe and loved, that's more important than any paper those men can wave around." Mary shifted Grace to her other arm and leaned forward. "Uncle Donald, I need to tell you something about why we were really on that train." Donald could see the struggle in her young face, the weight of secrets she'd been carrying. "Go ahead, Mary. You can tell me anything." "We weren't really orphans," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, our parents are still alive. At least, they were when we left Philadelphia. The confession came out in fragments, interrupted by tears and the need to comfort the younger children as they relived painful memories. Their families hadn't given them up willingly. Their parents had been told the children were going to a special school, a temporary placement that would give them better opportunities while their families got back on their feet after the economic hardships that had struck the city. "Mama said she'd write to us every week," Sarah said, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "She said it was just until Papa found steady work again, but no letters ever came," Sam added. "And when we asked about visiting home, they said we had to focus on our new lives." Donald felt anger building in his chest, not the quick flash of temper, but the deep, righteous fury that came from witnessing injustice against the innocent. These children hadn't been rescued from poverty or abandonment. They'd been stolen from families who loved them, lied to by people who treated them like commodities. "The lady who ran the orphanage," Mary continued, "she had papers that she said proved our parents had signed us over permanently. But I saw Mama sign those papers and she was crying. She kept asking if she was doing the right thing, if we'd really be better off." "She didn't know," Ben said, his small voice filled with wisdom beyond his years. "None of our parents knew what was really going to happen to us." Donald opened the Bible again, this time to a passage Martha had marked years ago, words about defending the fatherless and pleading for the widow. But these children weren't fatherless, he realized. They were victims of a system that had deliberately separated them from loving families for reasons that had nothing to do with their welfare. "Tomorrow," Donald said, closing the book with quiet determination, "I'm going to write some letters." "To who?" Mary asked. "To people who might be able to help. To newspapers in Philadelphia, who might want to know what's really happening to children like you. To churches and organizations that work to keep families together." Donald looked around at their faces, seeing hope beginning to replace fear. "And if I can manage it, to your parents." The children's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Ben launched himself into Donald's arms, while the twins began talking over each other about what they wanted to tell their families. Mary's careful composure finally cracked completely, and she wept with relief at the possibility of reconnecting with her mother. "Do you really think we can find them?" she asked through her tears. "I think we can try," Donald replied. "And in the meantime, you're safe here, all of you." As he tucked the children into their sleeping arrangements that night, Donald reflected on how much his life had changed in just over a week. He'd come to this cabin to mourn in solitude, to grieve his losses away from the well-meaning but suffocating attention of his community. Instead, he'd found purpose, joy, and a family he'd never expected. "Uncle Donald?" Grace called from her little nest of blankets, her vocabulary expanding daily. "Yes, sweetheart." "Story?" Donald settled into his chair and began to tell her about the farm animals back home, about Martha's gentle way with horses, about the rhythm of seasons on Amish land. As he spoke, he became aware that he was no longer just telling stories about his past. He was sharing his heritage with children who were becoming part of his future. Later, after all the children were asleep, Donald sat at his small table and began the first of what would be many letters. He wrote to the Philadelphia newspapers, describing what he'd witnessed and learned about the orphan train system. He wrote to social reform organizations, documenting the children's experiences with careful detail. And most importantly, he began letters addressed simply to parents of missing children. Philadelphia, messages that might never reach their intended recipients, but that he had to try to send. As dawn approached and Donald's hand cramped from writing, he looked over at the sleeping children who had transformed his retreat into a home. Eli lay stretched across the threshold, his body positioned to guard the children even in sleep. The wooden cross on the wall caught the first light of morning, and Donald felt Martha's presence as surely as if she were sitting beside him. "You were right," he whispered to her memory. "The Lord did have more plans for me." Outside, the forest was beginning to wake up with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures starting their day. Inside the cabin, 5 children slept peacefully under the protection of a man who had discovered that love could make him braver than he'd ever imagined possible. The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Donald had sent his careful inquiries to Philadelphia. He found it slipped under his door, not delivered by any postal service, but placed there during the night by someone who knew exactly where to find him. The envelope bore no return address, but inside was a message written in careful script. "Mr. Proder, I believe we need to talk. Meet me at Henderson's store at noon today. Come alone and tell no one. The children's lives may depend on it." A friend. Donald stared at the mysterious note, his mind racing through possibilities. It could be a trap, a way to lure him away from the children so authorities could take them. But something about the tone suggested genuine concern rather than official threat. He spent the morning preparing the children for his absence, showing Mary where he'd hidden emergency supplies and reviewing their safety procedures. "If I'm not back by nightfall," he told her, "take everyone to the old mine shaft we found last week. Stay there until you're sure it's safe." Mary's eyes were wide with worry, but she nodded solemnly. "Be careful, Uncle Donald." Henderson's store was nearly empty when Donald arrived, just Ellen behind the counter and a stranger sitting at the small table, where local men usually gathered to drink coffee and discuss weather. The stranger was a man in his 40s, well-dressed but travel-worn, with intelligent eyes that held a mixture of urgency and fear. "Mr. Proder?" The man rose and extended his hand. "I'm Thomas Morrison. I think you're caring for some children I've been searching for." Donald's blood chilled. Another official, another threat to the family he'd grown to love. But before he could respond, the man continued. "I'm not here to take them away," Morrison said quickly. "I'm here to help them get home. You see, one of those children is my daughter." The words hit Donald like a physical blow. He sank into the chair across from Morrison, his mind struggling to process this revelation. "Your daughter?" "Mary Morrison," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. 12 years old, brown hair, reads everything she can get her hands on. The bravest child I've ever known. Tears filled his eyes. "Mr. Proder, I've been searching for her and the others for weeks." Donald studied the man's face, looking for any sign of deception. "Mary told me her parents thought they were sending her to a school. We did think that," Morrison said, his voice heavy with regret. "My wife and we lost our jobs when the factory closed. We couldn't afford to feed the children properly, couldn't keep up with rent. When the social workers came and said there was a special program, a school where Mary could get a good education while we got back on our feet," he stopped. Unable to continue, Ellen Henderson approached their table with 2 cups of coffee, her expression carefully neutral. "I'll just be in the back room," she said meaningfully, taking inventory. "Won't be able to hear any conversation that might be happening out here." After she left, Morrison pulled a worn photograph from his wallet. It showed a family group, a man and woman with 3 children, including a girl who was unmistakably Mary, though younger and carefree in a way Donald had never seen her. "We were supposed to be able to visit after a month," Morrison continued. "We were told we could write letters, stay in contact. But every time we tried, we were told the children were adjusting and contact would be disruptive. Then we got word that they'd been transferred to another facility for better opportunities. The orphan train," Donald said grimly. Morrison's face hardened. "That's when I knew something was terribly wrong. I started investigating, asking questions, following paper trails. Mr. Proder, what I found, it's worse than you can imagine. Over the next hour, Morrison laid out a conspiracy that made Donald's stomach turn. The orphan train system, originally designed to help genuinely parentless children, had been corrupted by officials who saw profit in supplying rural areas with young workers. Children were being taken from struggling families under false pretenses. Their parents told lies about temporary placements and educational opportunities. There are hundreds of children involved, Morrison said. Maybe thousands. Families across Philadelphia and other cities who think their children are in schools or temporary care, while those children are actually being shipped west as laborers. But why? Donald asked, though he was beginning to understand the horrific logic. Money, Morrison said simply. Rural families pay placement fees. Some of the children end up with good families, but others... He stopped, unable to voice what they both knew. Morrison pulled another document from his coat, a letter hidden in Mary's dress pocket. The one Donald had seen but never fully examined. This is what convinced me you were genuinely trying to help them. Mary managed to hide this when the train crashed. It's evidence of what they were really doing. The letter was addressed to a farm family in Ohio, describing Mary not as a daughter to be adopted, but as a strong, capable worker, experienced with younger children and household tasks. The price mentioned made Donald's blood run cold. These children were being sold. "Mr. Proder," Morrison said, leaning forward intensely, "I need your help. You're the only person who's actually been caring for these children properly. You're the only one they trust. But if we're going to expose this conspiracy and get all the children home to their real families, we need to do it carefully." "What do you mean?" "The people running this operation have connections everywhere. Social services, law enforcement, even some judges. If we just turn the children over to authorities, they'll disappear into the system again. We need evidence, we need media attention, and we need to make sure the children are protected while we build a case." Donald thought of the federal marshal who'd been asking questions, of the official papers threatening legal action against anyone harboring the children. "How do I know you're really Mary's father? How do I know this isn't another trick?" Morrison smiled sadly and pulled out one more item, a small wooden doll with intricate carving. "Mary made this for her mother's birthday last year. She carved it herself, learned how from watching her grandfather work. She's always been good with her hands." Donald recognized the craftsmanship immediately. It was the same steady skill he'd seen when Mary helped him with woodworking projects around the cabin. "She carved toys for the younger children," he said slowly. "That's my Mary," Morrison said with pride and pain. "Always taking care of everyone else. What do you want me to do?" "Keep them safe while I gather more evidence. I've been in contact with a newspaper reporter in Philadelphia, someone who specializes in exposing government corruption. But we need time to build an airtight case. If we move too quickly, the people responsible will just cover their tracks and start up somewhere else." Donald sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the scope of what Morrison was describing. These 5 children weren't just victims of one tragic accident. They were part of a systematic corruption that was destroying families across multiple states. "There's something else," Morrison said quietly. "The other children with Mary, I've been trying to find their families too. Some of them are still alive, still searching. But some..." He stopped, his expression grim. "Some what?" "Some of the parents were told their children died in accidents. Convenient accidents that happened after the children were already on trains heading west." The magnitude of the evil they were dealing with hit Donald like a blow to the chest. Not only were children being stolen from their families, but some parents were being told their children were dead to prevent them from searching. "Mr. Proder," Morrison said, "I know I'm asking a lot. I know you've already risked everything to protect these children. But will you help us? Will you help us bring down the people who did this and get all these children home where they belong?" Donald thought of Mary reading stories to the younger children by firelight. He thought of Ben's trusting smile as he played with his carved horse. He thought of Grace calling him Papa, and the twins helping with daily chores as if they'd always belonged in his life. "Yes," he said simply. "But I need to know, when this is over, when the children go home to their families, what happens to me?" Morrison's expression softened with understanding. "Mr. Proder, from what I can see, you've given these children something precious, safety, love, and healing when they needed it most. No parent could ask for more than that from someone who cared for their child." As Donald walked back to his truck for the drive home, he felt the weight of new responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was no longer just hiding children from authorities. He was part of a larger fight for justice that would require courage he wasn't sure he possessed, but as he thought of 5 young faces waiting for him at the cabin, he knew he would find that courage somehow. Martha had been right. The Lord did have more plans for him. Plans that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, about family and justice, about the price of doing what was right in a world that seemed determined to punish goodness. The reunion between Mary and her father took place 3 days later in the quiet sanctuary of Donald's cabin. Donald had spent those days preparing the children, especially Mary, for the possibility that someone claiming to be her father might not be telling the truth. But the moment Thomas Morrison stepped through the cabin door and Mary saw his face, all doubts vanished. "Papa," she whispered, and then she was running into his arms. 12 years of forced maturity dissolving into the tears of a child who had finally found her way home. Donald watched from across the room as father and daughter held each other, both crying openly. The other children gathered around uncertainly, having heard about Mary's father, but not quite understanding what his arrival meant for their makeshift family. "Papa," Mary said through her tears, "I kept them safe. I kept them all together, just like Mama taught me." "I know you did, sweetheart," Morrison replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you did." Over the next several hours, Morrison shared what he had learned about the other children's families. Sam and Sarah's parents were alive and frantically searching, having been told their twins were in a special program for gifted children. Ben's mother had been widowed shortly before his placement and was working 2 jobs to pay for what she believed was his education at a private academy. The news about Grace was more complicated. The toddler's parents had died in a factory fire, but she had an aunt and uncle who had been trying to gain custody when social services intervened, claiming the relatives were unfit. "They've been fighting in court for months," Morrison explained. "They never knew Grace had been put on an orphan train." Donald felt a complex mixture of emotions as he listened to these revelations. Joy that the children would be reunited with their families, but also a deep sadness at the prospect of losing the family he'd grown to love. These children had filled the empty spaces in his heart, had given him purpose and joy he'd thought were lost forever with Martha's death, but his personal feelings had to take second place to what was best for the children. And what was best for them was exposure of the truth and reunion with their birth families. "There's more," Morrison said quietly, after the children had settled down for the evening. "The reporter I've been working with, Catherine Walsh from the Philadelphia Herald, she's managed to trace the money trail. The corruption goes higher than we thought. There are state officials involved, maybe even federal ones." Donald absorbed this information with growing concern. "What does that mean for the children?" "It means we have to be very careful about how we proceed. If we simply turn them over to the wrong authorities, they could disappear into the system again. We need to make this public in a way that forces honest officials to take action." Morrison pulled out a manila folder thick with documents. "Catherine wants to publish a major expose, but she needs more than just our word. She needs official documentation, witness testimony, and most importantly, she needs the children to be safe while the story breaks." "What are you suggesting? A coordinated effort?" "Catherine publishes the story, complete with photos and interviews with families who've been searching for their children. At the same time, we present the children to honest law enforcement, people Catherine has vetted, people we can trust. And we do it all publicly, with reporters present, so there's no way for the corrupt officials to make the children disappear again." Donald understood the logic, but the plan filled him with anxiety. "These children have been through enough trauma. Do you really want to put them in front of reporters and cameras?" Morrison's expression grew pained. "Donald, may I call you Donald? I don't want to put them through anything else. But if we don't expose this publicly, hundreds of other children will suffer the same fate. Mary and the others could help save families they'll never meet." That night, as Donald tucked the children into their sleeping arrangements, he struggled with how to explain what was coming. They had finally found safety and stability, had begun to heal from their traumas. And now he had to tell them that their quiet refuge was about to become the center of a public battle for justice. "Uncle Donald," Ben said as Donald pulled the blanket up to his chin, "are you sad?" Why do you ask that, little one? You look sad. Like when Eli used to look sad before he started wagging his tail again. Donald smiled, despite his heavy heart. I'm not sad, Ben. I'm just thinking about big decisions. Are we going to have to leave? Sarah asked from her nearby sleeping spot. Donald knelt down so he could look at all the children. I want you all to listen carefully. In a few days, there are going to be some changes. Mr. Morrison, Mary's papa, he's going to help you get back to your real families. The response was immediate and mixed. Mary looked torn between joy at the prospect of seeing her mother again and distress at leaving the security they'd found. The twins held hands tightly, their faces showing confusion and fear. Ben's lower lip began to tremble. But what about you? He asked in a small voice. What about our family here? Donald felt his throat tighten with emotion. Ben, Sam, Sarah, Grace, you all have people who love you and have been looking for you. Your real parents, your real families, they've been worried sick, searching everywhere, praying you were safe. But we want to stay with you too, Sam said, speaking for all of them. And I want you to stay, Donald admitted, his voice breaking slightly. But sometimes loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even when it's hard for us. Mary, wise beyond her years, seemed to understand the complexity of the situation. Uncle Donald, will we ever see you again? I hope so, Mary, I hope so. Over the next 2 days, Morrison and Catherine Walsh worked to coordinate their plan. The reporter proved to be a woman in her 30s with fierce determination and a genuine passion for protecting children. When she met with the children, she was gentle but thorough, gathering their stories with the skill of someone who understood both the importance of truth and the fragility of young hearts. These children are heroes, she told Donald privately. Their testimony could bring down an entire network of corruption. Donald watched Mary answer Catherine's questions with the same brave composure she'd shown throughout their ordeal. But he also saw the cost of that bravery, the way her hands shook slightly when she described the train wreck, the way she instinctively reached for the younger children whenever anyone mentioned separation. The plan was set for the following Monday. Catherine would publish her exposé in the Sunday edition of the Herald, including interviews with searching parents and documentation of the corruption. On Monday morning, Donald and Morrison would bring the children to the county courthouse, where honest law enforcement officials would take custody while reporters documented the reunion. It has to be public, Morrison explained. That's the only way to ensure their safety and prevent retaliation. On Saturday night, Donald sat with the children around their familiar circle by the fireplace. It would be their last evening together as the family they'd become, and everyone seemed to feel the weight of that ending. Uncle Donald, Grace said, settling into his lap as she had every evening for weeks. Story? Donald began to tell them about Martha, about their life together, about the love that had sustained them through 43 years of marriage. But as he spoke, he realized he was also telling them about the kind of love that lets go when it has to, the kind of courage that chooses what's right over what's easy. Your Martha sounds like she was wonderful, Mary said when he finished. She was. And you know what she would say about all of you? What? The children asked in unison. She would say that taking care of you, loving you, being your family for these weeks, it was the greatest honor of my life. And she would say that letting you go home to your birth families is the greatest gift I could give you. That night, Donald lay awake, listening to the children's breathing, memorizing the sounds of family life that had filled his cabin with such joy. Tomorrow they would face reporters and officials, would begin the process of exposure and reunion that would change all their lives forever. But tonight, they were still his family, still safe in the circle of love they'd created together. And that was something no authority, no system, no corruption could ever take away from any of them. Outside, the autumn wind rustled through the pine trees, and Donald could almost hear Martha's voice carried on the breeze. Well done, my love. Well done. Monday morning arrived grey and drizzling, as if the weather itself reflected the somber mood in Donald's cabin. The children were unusually quiet as they dressed, in the clean clothes Donald had bought them weeks ago. Clothes that had been chosen with love and hope for a future. Together, that was now coming to an end. And Donald helped Grace into her small coat, while Mary gathered the few possessions they would take with them. The wooden toys he had carved, the books they had shared, the simple treasures that marked their time as a family. Thomas Morrison arrived early, his face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent worrying about what the day would bring. The Herald published the story, Morrison announced, holding up a newspaper with a front-page headline that read, "Children for Sale, the Hidden Corruption in Pennsylvania's Orphan Train System." Below it were photographs of the 5 children and several other families who had been searching for their missing sons and daughters. Donald scanned the article, seeing their story laid out in stark black and white. The train wreck, the children's survival, their discovery at his cabin, and most importantly, the documented evidence of the money trail that led back to corrupt officials. Catherine Walsh had done her job well. The story was thorough, compelling, and impossible to ignore. "There's already been response," Morrison continued. "The governor's office has announced an immediate investigation. The FBI is opening files on the officials named in the article." And his voice caught with emotion. "My wife is driving down from Philadelphia. She'll be at the courthouse when we arrive." Mary's face lit up with the first genuine smile Donald had seen from her in days. "Mama's coming?" "She's coming, sweetheart. She can't wait to see you." The drive to the county courthouse was quiet, except for Grace's occasional babbling and the soft sound of rain against the windshield. Donald found himself memorizing details, the way Sam and Sarah held hands in the back seat, the way Ben clutched his carved wooden horse, the way Mary sat straight and brave, despite the tears in her eyes. The courthouse square was already crowded when they arrived. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like electronic prayers. Reporters clustered around the main entrance, while a group of what looked like parents stood to one side. Holding photographs and scanning every face, hopefully, Donald recognized the scene from Catherine's description, but seeing it in person was overwhelming. This was no longer just about 5 children finding their way home. It had become a symbol of a much larger fight for justice and truth. Mr. Proder, a woman, approached their group as they climbed out of Morrison's car. She was in her 40s, well-dressed, with kind eyes and an official-looking badge. "I'm Judge Margaret Sullivan. I'll be overseeing the children's custody today." Donald shook her hand, grateful to see genuine concern in her expression, rather than the cold bureaucracy he had feared. "Judge Sullivan has been personally vetted by Catherine and my legal contacts," Morrison explained quietly. "She's completely trustworthy." "Mr. Proder," Judge Sullivan said, "I want you to know that your care of these children has been exemplary. The medical examinations show they're healthy, well-nourished, and clearly well-loved. You should be proud of what you've done." Before Donald could respond, a cry rang out from across the square. "Mary, Mary, my baby!" A woman broke free from the group of waiting parents and ran toward them, her face streaming with tears. Donald recognized her instantly from the family photograph Morrison had shown him. Mary's mother, older and more worn than in the picture, but unmistakably the same person. The reunion between Mary and her mother was everything Donald had hoped it would be. Joyful, tearful, and complete. They held each other as if they would never let go, both crying and laughing at the same time. "Mama," Mary sobbed, "I knew you didn't give me away. I knew you were looking for me. Every day, sweetheart. Every single day." Other reunions followed quickly. Sam and Sarah's parents had driven through the night from Philadelphia, arriving just as the children were led into the courthouse. Ben's mother, a young widow still wearing her factory uniform from the night shift, wept openly as she held her son. Only Grace remained without family present, though Morrison had assured Donald that her aunt and uncle were driving down and would arrive within hours. Inside the courthouse, Judge Sullivan conducted the formal proceedings with dignity and care. Each child was asked simple questions about their experiences, their treatment while with Donald, and their wishes for the future. Their answers were consistent and heartfelt. They wanted to go home to their birth families. But they also wanted Donald to remain part of their lives somehow. Your Honor, Mary said when it was her turn to speak, Uncle Donald saved us, not just from the woods or from being hungry, but from forgetting that there were good people in the world. He made us feel like a family when we thought we'd never have one again. Judge Sullivan looked at Donald with respect. Mr. Proder, the court recognizes that your actions, while technically outside the law, were motivated by the highest principles of human decency. Not only will there be no charges filed against you, but I'm personally recommending you for a civilian commendation for your service to these children. The formal proceedings concluded with arrangements for ongoing contact between Donald and the children, supervised visits, and even the possibility of him serving as an honorary uncle in their lives going forward. It wasn't the same as the family they had built in the cabin, but it was something, a way for love to continue even as circumstances changed. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Catherine Walsh approached Donald with a final piece of news. "The story has been picked up nationally," she said. "There are already investigations starting in other states. These 5 children may have helped save hundreds of others." Donald looked around at the children, who were now reunited with their birth families, saw their faces bright with joy and hope for the future, and felt a complex mixture of loss and satisfaction. They were going home where they belonged, and their courage had helped expose a system that had hurt so many others. But as Grace toddled over to him one last time and wrapped her small arms around his legs, calling Papa in her sweet voice, Donald felt his heart breaking and healing at the same time. 6 months later, Donald stood in the same courthouse where the children's custody had been resolved, but this time the circumstances were remarkably different. The grand jury investigation had concluded, and the final hearing was about to begin for the officials, who had been arrested in the wake of Catherine Walsh's exposé. The courtroom was packed with families, not just those of the 5 children Donald had sheltered, but dozens of others who had come forward after the story broke. Parents who had been told their children were dead, families who had been separated by lies and false promises, children who had been found working on farms far from home under conditions that amounted to slavery. Donald sat in the front row, flanked by Thomas Morrison and Judge Sullivan, who had become an advocate for reform of the entire system. Behind him, he could hear the familiar voices of Mary, Sam, Sarah, Ben, and Grace, who had all come with their parents to witness the conclusion of the case that had started with their courage. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Harrison, the bailiff, announced. Judge Harrison was a stern man in his 60s who had presided over the grand jury proceedings with obvious disgust for what had been uncovered. As he took his seat, his eyes swept the courtroom with the gravity appropriate to the magnitude of the crimes being addressed. "In all my years on the bench," Judge Harrison began, "I have rarely encountered a case that so thoroughly violated the public trust and so callously disregarded the welfare of children. Today, we conclude the prosecution of individuals who turned what should have been a system of mercy into an engine of exploitation. The defendants were led into the courtroom in shackles, 7 men and 2 women who had been responsible for the orphan train corruption. Among them was the federal marshal who had first come looking for the children. A man Donald now knew had been taking bribes to ensure certain children never made it to their intended destinations. Before we proceed to sentencing," Judge Harrison continued, "the court will hear impact statements from those affected by these crimes." Thomas Morrison was the first to speak, his voice steady as he described the months of anguish his family had endured, believing their daughter was receiving an education while she was actually being transported like cargo across state lines. Mary's mother, Eleanor Morrison, followed her husband to the witness stand. "My daughter was 12 years old when she was taken from us," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "For months I blamed myself for sending her away. I thought I had failed as a mother. These people didn't just steal our children, they stole our faith in ourselves as parents." One by one, other parents told similar stories. A father whose twin boys had been told they were going to a specialized school for gifted children, only to end up as unpaid labor on a remote farm. A grandmother whose granddaughter had disappeared into the system after being promised a better life. But it was when Donald himself was called to speak that the courtroom fell completely silent. "Your Honor," Donald began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had comforted 5 frightened children in a mountain cabin. "I came to know these 5 children by accident, but I came to love them by choice. What I witnessed in those weeks we spent together was not just the resilience of young people who had survived trauma, but the fundamental human need for family, for belonging, for being treated with dignity rather than as property." He paused, looking directly at the defendants. These individuals didn't just break laws, they broke the sacred trust that exists between society and its most vulnerable members. They took children who needed protection and turned them into commodities. They separated families that loved each other and replaced that love with fear and desperation. Donald's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But I also want to say something about redemption. These 5 children, and all the others who have been found and returned to their families, have shown us what real courage looks like. They have turned their suffering into a force for justice. They have made sure that what happened to them will not happen to others." When Donald returned to his seat, Mary Morrison rose from where she sat with her parents and walked to the witness stand. At 13 now, she had grown taller and stronger, but she still carried herself with the same brave dignity Donald remembered from their first meeting. "Your Honor," Mary said, her voice clear and confident, "I want to thank Uncle Donald for teaching us that even when bad things happen, there are still good people in the world. He showed us that family isn't just about blood, it's about people who choose to love and protect each other." She turned to look at the defendants. "What you did was wrong, and it hurt a lot of families. But it also brought us together with people like Uncle Donald and Judge Sullivan and Ms. Walsh and all the others who fought to make things right. So in a way, your bad choices led to something good." Judge Harrison's expression softened as he looked at Mary. "Young lady, your maturity and wisdom are remarkable. The court is honored by your presence here today." The sentencing that followed was swift and decisive. Federal prison terms ranging from 10 to 25 years, financial restitution to affected families, and permanent prohibition from working with children or social services. Justice, Donald reflected, was sometimes slow in coming, but when it arrived, it could be thorough. As the court session concluded and families began to file out, Donald felt a small hand slip into his. Grace, now 3.5, looked up at him with bright eyes. "Papa Donald," she said, the name all 5 children had settled on for him, "are we going to have dinner together tonight?" Donald smiled, his heart full despite all the changes and challenges of the past months. "Yes, sweetheart, we're all going to have dinner together tonight." 2 years after that grey Monday morning at the courthouse, Donald Proder stood on the porch of his cabin, the same cabin where 5 frightened children had first found refuge, but which had since been transformed into something he never could have imagined. The single-room structure had grown into a proper home, with an addition that included 2 guest bedrooms and a larger kitchen. The yard, once just a clearing in the forest, now featured a vegetable garden, a swing set, and a fire pit surrounded by log benches. Most remarkably, there was a sign by the front gate that read, "The Proder Family Refuge," a designation that had come about quite naturally, without any official planning. It was Thanksgiving Day, and Donald could hear the sounds of family preparation coming from inside the house. Mary, now 15 and visiting for the school holiday, was reading to Grace while helping her mother Eleanor set the table. Sam and Sarah, 11 now and growing like weeds, were helping their father Thomas prepare firewood for the evening gathering. Ben, 8 years old and as curious as ever, was showing Donald's Amish neighbor, Bishop Miller, the workshop where Donald had been teaching him wood carving. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the court proceedings, the families had stayed in touch, bound together by the shared experience of loss, recovery, and justice. What began as occasional visits had evolved into regular gatherings, then extended stays. and finally into something that resembled an extended family, with the cabin as its heart. Donald's own Amish community had taken longer to accept these changes. Some members had been scandalized by his involvement with English law enforcement and his appearance in newspapers and courtrooms. But Bishop Miller, after witnessing the love and healing that had taken place, had come to understand that sometimes God's work required stepping outside traditional boundaries. "Donald," the bishop said as he and Ben approached the porch, "this young man has quite a talent for carving. His horse looks almost ready to gallop." Ben beamed with pride, holding up the wooden figure he'd been working on for weeks. "Uncle Donald taught me to see the animal inside the wood before I start cutting," he explained to the bishop. Uncle Donald had become Donald's permanent title with all the children, a designation that carried both affection and respect. Though they had returned to their birth families, the bonds formed during those crucial weeks in the cabin had never broken. Instead, they had grown stronger, creating a network of relationships that enriched everyone involved. Thomas Morrison emerged from the cabin, carrying an armload of dishes. "Donald, Eleanor wants to know if you think we have enough food for everyone. I told her we could probably feed half of Philadelphia with what she's prepared." The guest list for today's dinner included not only the 5 families, but also Judge Sullivan and her husband, Catherine Walsh, and her children, Ellen Henderson from the general store, and Sheriff Davis, the honest lawman who had helped ensure the children's safety during the investigation. What had started as a rescue had become a community. "Papa Donald! Papa Donald!" Grace came running out of the cabin, her 4-year-old legs carrying her as fast as they could go. She launched herself into Donald's arms with the complete trust of a child who had never doubted she was loved. Grace's situation had been the most complex to resolve. Her aunt and uncle had indeed gained custody, but they lived in a small apartment in the city and struggled to provide the kind of environment a traumatized child needed. After months of careful negotiation and legal proceedings, they had agreed to a unique arrangement. Grace would live with them during the school year, but spend summers and holidays at the cabin with Donald, who had become her grandfather in every way that mattered. "Tell me about the turkey," Grace demanded, settling into Donald's lap as she had every day for the past 2 weeks. "Well," Donald began, "once upon a time, there was a turkey who was very proud of his beautiful feathers as he spun the familiar tale." Donald was aware of the voices and activity surrounding him. Mary helping her mother in the kitchen, her voice carrying the confidence of a young woman who knew she was valued and loved. The twins arguing good-naturedly with their father about the best way to stack firewood. Ben showing his latest carving to anyone who would admire it. These sounds had become the soundtrack of Donald's life, not the silence of grief he had come to the cabin to find, but the beautiful noise of family life in all its complexity and joy. Later, as they all gathered around the extended table for dinner, Donald looked at the faces surrounding him. 3 generations represented, from Grace's 4 years to his own 65. Amish and English, parents and children, biological families and chosen families, all connected by the threads of love and shared experience. "Donald," Thomas Morrison said, rising with his wineglass, "would you lead us in grace?" Donald stood, feeling the weight of gratitude for all the changes the past 2 years had brought. "Lord," he began in the simple language that had sustained him through loss and led him to joy, "we thank you for this food, for this company, and for the reminder that families can be formed in the most unexpected ways. We thank you for second chances, for the courage to do right when it's difficult, and for the gift of love that multiplies when it's shared rather than diminished." He paused, looking at Martha's wooden cross, which now hung in a place of honor in the expanded home. "And we thank you for those who came before us, who taught us how to love, and who continue to guide us even when we can't see them." "Amen," came the chorus from around the table. As they began to eat, Grace tugged on Donald's sleeve. "Papa Donald, will you tell us the story again? About how we all became a family?" Donald smiled, his heart full of the kind of contentment he had thought was lost forever. "After dinner, sweetheart, After dinner, I'll tell you all about how a lonely old man and a faithful dog found 5 children in the woods, and how they all found their way home together. Outside, the Pennsylvania mountains were dressed in autumn colors, and inside, the Proder family refuge was filled with the warmth of love that had grown from the simplest of choices, the decision to help someone in need. No matter the cost, some families, Donald reflected, are born, others are chosen. The very best ones, he had learned, are both.